Good evening and welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana 104.5 FM. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I am here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers, in this case myself, and are not intended to represent WRFU, UCIMC, or, as we like to say on the televised version of this show, UPTV. These views are our own, and by our, in this instance, I mean myself. Me, myself, and I. I've made that joke way too many times. I apologize for it, but it's the only one that comes to mind when I recite my little mantra at the beginning of the show. In any event, have a few things to talk about today. This first thing is entitled Undocumented Immigrants Behind on Their Rent Are Self-Evicting Across Texas. This is one of those things that's just kind of happening out of sight of the media and most people who are not connected to those in these kinds of circumstances. And so it's not one of those things that you hear about, but we are going to share this with you now. Anyway, it reads as follows. The coronavirus pandemic pushed Maria and her family from a small 2-bedroom apartment in southeast Houston into homelessness in less than a month. Her boss cut her hours in a clothing warehouse in mid-March as business slowed. Without enough money to pay rent, she packed her belongings and found another place to live, even though there was a statewide moratorium on evictions. When I couldn't find how to pay, I just had to leave, said Maria, 47, who is an undocumented immigrant. I didn't want to be in debt, and I couldn't go to court. Maria asked that she be identified by a pseudonym out of fear that immigration authorities could seek to deport her. On paper, an undocumented tenant has the same rights as anyone else during the eviction process, but housing attorneys and tenant and immigration advocates say undocumented immigrants are frequently hesitant to exercise those options. Their fear of the legal system and lack of access to government-funded financial help prompt many to self-evict or prematurely leave the property, and as a result, many turn to a network of nonprofits and religious organizations accustomed to helping vulnerable people who keep the Texas economy humming. But those groups say the ability to assist is being stressed by the many people who were swiftly left without work due to the coronavirus pandemic's economic wallop. Zoe Middleton, in the Houston and Southeast Texas co-director of Texas Housers, an affordable housing advocacy group. She said that because immigration and customs enforcement agents are allowed in courthouses, undocumented renters avoid going inside these buildings out of fear of being deported. There have been cases in Texas in which undocumented immigrants were arrested in courthouses while appearing for cases unrelated to immigration. And editorial aside, you'll probably remember a couple weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, we talked about how the current administration is using a variety of different legal tactics to just make life miserable for immigrants and make it so that people are really unsure of just what their rights are, what can be done by them and what can be done to them is now a confusing array of different things, and there are a lot of rumors going around. So if you consider the fact that like someone like myself who's very keyed into what's going on in immigration can't always exactly say what's going on because so many different things are happening and it's so confusing. Just imagine being someone who really doesn't have much knowledge about the system generally and is not really in tune with what's in the media ordinarily. So it becomes very, very frightening and confusing for them. And that's the kind of situation we're in, and that's what this article is alluding to. Anyway, back to my story. I think the fear that concerns most of the undocumented tenants that I've spoken to is that somehow the eviction judges will collude with ICE, or that their documentation status will be used against them by their landlord, even if they try to remain on the property, she said. So they choose to leave the property so they don't risk detention and deportation. Many renters in Texas found temporary relief in eviction moratoriums, federal pandemic relief payments, unemployment checks, and rental assistance programs. Undocumented migrants, though, either don't qualify for such aid or are afraid that merely seeking it will alert immigration authorities to their presence in a country whose president has called some immigrants animals, makes racist remarks, and consistently tries to create barriers for migrants. In many of Texas's largest counties, evictions in June were lower than they were for the same month last year. In Harris County, where Maria lives, eviction filings were down about 67%. Local moratoriums, rent assistance programs, and other government aid have helped renters stay afloat for the time being. Still, housing advocates forecast a historical increase in evictions statewide due to the unprecedented unemployment COVID-19 swiftly spurred. But tenants who decide to leave on their own or self-evict many times don't even get to the point at which an eviction is filed, so there's no record of how many people, like Maria, pursue this route. When it comes to eviction, a verbal threat of eviction or lockout may result in an undocumented person packing up and leaving immediately, said Sandy Rollins, executive director of the Texas Tenants Union, a housing advocacy group. This could be due to the lack of understanding of their rights, but it could also be from fear of engaging with courts in order to stand up for their rights. Lindley Boone Almaguer, an attorney with the nonprofit Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, said that widespread job loss has compounded tenants' anxieties during the eviction process, and immigrants have been more affected by this year's historic unemployment than U.S.-born workers, according to an analysis by the Pew Research Center. There's a lot of home health care aides. There's a lot of people like certified nursing assistants, housekeepers, daycares, people both documented and undocumented that work in the service industry, she said. And so many of those people lost their jobs completely or lost hours, or they work at the flea market selling things. So there's so many jobs like that where people lost their already very limited income. And so you have seen evictions spiking during the COVID period. In these cases, many undocumented immigrants rely on their community and avoid seeking assistance from the government or nonprofits. But if they do reach out for benefits, like rent assistance, they face language barriers. When they want to ask for help from a nonprofit, and the staff only speaks English, they feel intimidated and don't want to go on, said Adrienne Godins, a volunteer for Dallas Area Interfaith, a community group made up of religious congregations, schools, and other nonprofits. Even if I tell them that there will be no problem and they won't ask for your Social Security, they prefer not to ask for help. And even people who go to the justice of the peace courts where eviction cases are heard face similar hurdles. A lot of JP courts won't have bilingual speakers, said Lisbeth Paradavia, a housing fellow at the University of Texas School of Law. Throughout Texas, that has been the case, where I'll call JP courts and they'll say, yeah, we don't have any Spanish speakers. We don't have any Spanish interpreters. Many undocumented people have been counting on their families, friends, and churches. Gonines has seen homes with 12 people living together as people who self-evict move in with loved ones. It's people of all ages, kids, adults, sometimes senior citizens, she said. Godines has worked with families searching for rental assistance, and she said that funds are running low among nonprofit organizations that are allowed to serve undocumented immigrants. We want to do more, but we don't have more resources, she said. But the little that we have in this community, we give it. Auxiliary Bishop Greg Kelly of the Catholic Diocese of Dallas, explained that many priests and churchgoers have pooled together resources to pay for rent and food for undocumented migrants, but he too worries how long such resources will last. I don't think we know yet how serious this is or how long it will last. When the City Assistance Program opened, the help available was overwhelmed in the first couple of hours, Kelly said. It could be a very lengthy situation. There's so much uncertainty. As Maria was planning to move out, she heard that a Christian pastor nearby was willing to let her live in a small apartment in the back of his church. She let her kids sleep on the king-size bed there, and she took a small couch. They had to share the kitchen with the church staff and churchgoers. Sometimes we wouldn't eat until everyone left the church, Maria said. She was grateful, but also sometimes uncomfortable. My way of thanking them was cleaning the church, she said. After almost 3 months there, she was asked to leave. A relative of the pastor was also having trouble paying rent and was going to use the apartment. Maria told the pastor not to worry, that she was going to find a solution. Even before the pandemic, things were tough in our community, said Josephine Lee, an organizer with the workers group El Pueblo Primero, which has been trying to help Maria. People were living check to check. This pandemic basically made it where it was completely unbearable. People call us saying the most of them haven't paid a month of rent, but half of those haven't paid for 2 or more months. Maria now lives apart from her family, though she still regularly sees her kids, who moved in with her ex-husband. She's been staying with a friend, trying to save some money to find a new place, but jobs are still hard to come by. She has managed to pick up work cleaning homes here and there, but not much more than that, and finding financial help is out of the question. Undocumented workers are not eligible for stimulus checks, and they can't apply for unemployment benefits. I don't have papers, but I file my taxes every year, said Maria, who uses an individual taxpayer identification number provided by the Internal Revenue Service, as do many other undocumented workers who don't have Social Security numbers. According to the IRS, ITIN, or ITIN users, paid more than $23.6 billion in taxes in 2015. In Texas, undocumented immigrants contributed $1.5 billion in local and state taxes, a 2017 study found. Maria's oldest daughter, who is a citizen and lost her job at a mall, applied for state unemployment benefits. But she tried and tried, and the website never worked, Maria said. If that would have worked out, we might have been fine. In Houston, Maria has appreciated the help from her community, but she said she's also ready to work. She hoped to get back to work at the clothing warehouse this week, but she never heard back from her former boss. Now she's applying to work in a plastics factory. Her goal is to save up for a car, to be able to access more jobs, and to have a steady paycheck to get a new home. Now I don't have furniture. I don't have beds to sleep. We only have clothes and our personal stuff, she said. But at the end, that's not the most important. What you really want is a place to be quiet, no matter if you have to sleep or eat on the floor. The important thing is to have a place of peace, to be with your kids. So, one thing I really liked about that story and why I wanted to read it is that it really personalizes the people and their situations. I mean, yes, it does push back on a lot of the nonsense that you hear about immigrants coming here and living off of social benefits and, just kind of sucking up all they can of benefits and just thinking of this as a place to come and be lazy. Like, oh, I don't want to work anymore. I don't want to do anything. I'm just going to come to the U.S. and sponge off of everybody else. And that's completely not true, and it has never been true, and it doesn't even make sense if you think about it with any kind of, brain, if I can put it that way. Because, it's a huge thing to uproot your life and go to another country. Lazy people are not noted for taking huge steps like that. Like, oh, I'm so lazy, I'm going to do something really, really difficult and totally turn my world upside down just so that I can continue to be lazy somewhere else where I have more access to more goodies that I can get for free. That's completely not even in the imagination of anyone who knows immigrants or works with immigrants at all. Most of them are very hardworking individuals, and they come here because they see opportunity. It's an opportunity to take your hard work and your initiative and your drive and make something out of it. The difference isn't in social benefits. We don't have very good social benefits here in the U.S. And if you think that we do, you've never tried to live off of them, or you've never known anyone who was stuck having to survive on or depend on the benefits that we have here. They're not good at all. If someone were really wanting to get, great social benefits, they'd go to like Sweden or Europe or something. There are a lot more places around the world that have better social benefits than the United States. So the notion that people are coming here because of our benefits is rooted in ignorance. At best. That's putting it like very mildly. and trying to give you the benefit of the doubt and saying that you are completely ignorant, if that's what you're thinking. No, most immigrants that come here are people who come here because they see this as a land of opportunity, and they want to take advantage of that opportunity and use their hard work and their energy and their drive to make something of themselves. So we'll get that out of the way first. But I like the way the story personalized the struggles that a lot of people have. It's not always as easy as black and white in terms of like, here's what you are legally able to do, and here's what you aren't. And it's as simple as that. And so everybody that's legally able to do this is doing that, and everyone else is having to deal with the other end of things. It's not like that at all. There are a lot of things that you could do as an immigrant that you don't do because you don't know that you can do it, because you're not sure you can do it, because you don't know anybody else who's doing it, because you don't really know how to do it, because you're afraid of doing it. And so there's a lot that goes on where people are making decisions that aren't necessarily I don't want to say the smartest, but the most effective for their situation, because they don't know how to do that, or they're not sure it's safe, or something like that. So anyway, I thought that was a good article, and it covered something that is going on not just in Texas, but all over the place right now. There are a lot of people who are in so-called, necessary jobs, who are important workers in these low-end kind of jobs, service jobs, like stocking grocery stores or delivering things. There are a lot of people that are doing that kind of thing and putting themselves in danger and risk of their health doing that. But there's also a lot of people in jobs that were more important, but more maybe something that people just did as a luxury, or they looked at as like, well, I've got extra spending money, I'm going to hire someone to come and do this or to do that. So there's a lot of those jobs in this gray area that have been lost because people are afraid, like, oh, I don't want strangers coming into my home right now, so I'm going to, cut back on housekeepers and things like that. And this is really hurting a lot of people in the immigrant community. Anyway, I'm going to move on. The next article here is entitled, Congress Rejected the 1920 Census, but there's only so much that crisis can tell us about today. So I think that Trump is trying to use the census to ensure that undocumented people are not counted in any way, and that will shift power to different communities. And so that has been a struggle that's been going on. The Supreme Court blocked that at one point, but Trump is still trying to figure out a way to do it. And as we mentioned in an earlier show that, when you tell this current administration that they can't legally do something, they try to figure out a way of doing it that's not exactly legal, but not exactly illegal, or they just keep trying to find a way to do things, regardless of whether they're told they can do it or not, or they should do it or not, or anything. I mean, it's just like they want what they want, and they're going for it no matter who gets hurt, or what has to be broken, what rules are broken, or norms tossed out the window, or whatever. So that's kind of what this is about, but there's an interesting analogy here that I thought you might find educational. So it reads as follows. In a stroke of historical irony, this year's potential for a botched decennial census comes on the 100th anniversary of the 1920 census, the only census that Congress rejected outright by refusing to do a reapportionment based on it. You probably didn't know this. Yet, for all the present-day parallels that can be found in the anti-immigrant sentiment that drove the 1920s crisis, that debacle does not provide much of a roadmap for how next year's Congress, particularly if it's Democratic, could deal with a 2020 census that's too flawed to use. If anything, the fiasco of a century ago was a mirror opposite of the conundrum that is shaping up this year. As the Trump administration's move to rush the census has highlighted or heightened the risk of an unacceptably inaccurate count. It's not that the data from the 1920 census was lacking in quality. Recent scholarship confirms that accuracy issues weren't what was really driving political actors then to call the data unusable. It was that Congress did not like that the data instructed lawmakers to do, did not like what the data instructed lawmakers to do when it came time to reallot House seats among the states. As explained by Margot Anderson in her book, The American Census, A Social History, the 1920 census captured significant population shifts that meant several states with major urban areas stood to gain House seats in reapportionment, at the cost of the rural states whose share of the population had shrunk. The results confirmed long-standing nativist fears about immigration and spurred Congress to take up restrictive immigration measures. But what to do about reapportionment was ultimately a bigger challenge for the Congress, whose rural members did not want to relinquish their electoral power to the more urban parts of the country. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Several attempts throughout the decade to rework the apportionment system in a way that would solve this standoff fell short in Congress. Instead, the apportionment that was determined by the 1910 census carried through the 1920s, and only in 1929 did Congress pass a bill that created an automatic apportionment procedure that was used after the 1930 census. Besides the difference in circumstances, other things have changed that make it difficult to imagine lawmakers being able to outright refuse to reapportion based on the 2020 census, the way their predecessors did in the 1920s. For one, thanks to the 1920s debacle, Congress is no longer expected to proactively take up apportionment, the way it had following censuses prior to 1920. The 1929 bill instead set up a system for apportionment to be calculated automatically after each decennial census. Because until 1920, Congress had to deal with this reapportionment issue every decade. There was a knowledge base built up among the members and among the political elites about what was coming and what to do, Anderson told me last week. The automatic apportionment contest that was instituted in the 1920s essentially let that knowledge atrophy, and frankly, members of Congress haven't thought about this issue seriously for several years. And there are also legal questions about whether Congress in the 1920s violated its constitutional duties by refusing to reallot House seats based on that decennial census. That claim was never decided by the courts in the 1920s, but in the redistricting legal battles of the 1960s, the court put additional guardrails on how political representation is doled out around the country. A census law passed by Congress in the 1970s prohibited mid-decade censuses from being used for apportionment. Even if that law was to be changed, it is still an open question whether the courts would tolerate, on constitutional grounds, a Congress that refused to based on a census it deemed not accurate enough. How bad does the data have to be that it's okay that apportionment just does not have to happen? Said Justin Levitt, an election law professor at Loyola Marymount. We don't know, and that's the thing that's quite scary. So this is something that sorry, my chair is very squeaky. This is something that a lot of people don't know about, is that in the 1920s, the Congress did not want to accept and did not actually accept the census, not based on the quality of the census, like what we're facing here in 2020, where it is very unlikely that a rushed census during a pandemic is going to accurately count people, but because they just didn't want to accept the results. And so they didn't. And that's something that a lot of people have gone to a lot of trouble to make sure that they can't do that again. And now we're faced with a different situation where we're going to have a census that just is simply and very probably not accurate because, like I said, it's being done during a pandemic, which makes it hard to begin with. And the Trump administration suddenly wants to rush it and shorten by a month how much time it was going to take to do it. Whereas before, they were actually saying they wanted more time. Suddenly, they not only don't want more time, they want less time than usual to do it. And so it's going to be a messed up thing no matter what. But what can be done about it, I do not know. So I just thought that was an interesting story and a little bit of history that people might find educational at this point in time. Anyway, here's something we've been reading a lot about lately, and you may have heard about. It is entitled, Advocates Urge a Legal Review of Trump Immigration Policies After a Report Finds 2 Top Officials Are Not Eligible to Serve. So immigrant rights groups and Texas Democrats are urging a review on the legality of Trump administration immigration policies after a government watchdog found 2 of the White House's top immigration officials are not legally eligible to serve in their respective positions. Editorial aside, you remember I was talking just a second ago about how the Trump administration just decides what it wants to do and tries to do it, whether it's legal or not, whether it's ethical or not, whether anybody gets hurt by it, whether anything is broken or destroyed or made unworkable because of it. And this is another example of that. This is a huge example that Trump can't get a lot of his people he wants to appoint through Congress because they're simply not acceptable. And so he appoints these over-the-top ideologues in secondary positions, and then they act as acting directors of these agencies instead, and he just doesn't bother to nominate anyone for the position. And anyway, unethical, yes. Illegal, apparently so. Doing it anyway? Yeah, okay. Back to the story. The Government Accountability Office on Friday determined that Chad Wolf, acting Department of Homeland Security Secretary, and Ken Cuccinelli, a senior official performing Deputy Secretary duties, aren't legally qualified to hold those posts.